It was in 1957 that there was a world event that changed my life and the lives of many others. I was just a kid in high school at the time. In fact, I wasn't quite in high school. But the Russians decided to launch a satellite called Sputnik. And that satellite, the size of a basketball, which emitted a tone as it flew through space, scared the world out of us, to the point where the United States of America did something that was controversial, but we felt was necessary. We decided that the federal government of the United States would loan money to students like Durbin to go to college, because we were afraid of the Russians. And we knew that if they had a scientific advantage on us, it could mean we would lose a war, which no one wants that to ever happen. And so we created here in Washington something called the National Defense Education Act. I'm sure that was carefully chosen to remind people that what we were doing was defending the country by loaning money to people like Durbin to go to college. And I took advantage of it. Those National Defense Education Act loans had terms that most of us from that era remember very well. You didn't pay anything on your loan balance for the first year you were out of college, and then you had 10 years to pay it off at 3% interest. Of course, those of us who took out the loans had to, and took out the loans for college, in my case for law school as well, amassed this great debt and worried when the day came for graduation whether we would ever be able to pay it off. I remember saying to my wife, Loretta, they just got all the National Defense Education Act loans. They put them all together. I'm afraid to tell you what's happened. We have a debt of $8,000 for college and law school. Students today don't believe that number, but that was the number, and it scared us to death that we wouldn't be able to pay it off in 10 years. Naturally, we did, and many others did as well. And the National Defense Education Act really became the pillar of the emergence of higher education in America. Of course, there were those who cheated the system, and stories were rampant. Whether they were all true, I'm not sure. The story of the doctor who graduated from medical school and before he went into his lucrative practice filed for bankruptcy and discharged all his federal loans, federal student loans. I don't know if that ever happened, but it certainly was part of the urban legend around National Defense Education Act. And so over the years, there were efforts made to change the National Defense Education Act to avoid abuse. And one of the things that was decided was that that loan to go to school would not be dischargeable in bankruptcy. And you have to ask the basic question of how many debt.
Will be in order.
You have to ask the basic question of how many debts are not dischargeable in bankruptcy. There are only a few: alimony, child support, criminal fines, taxes, maybe one other, but I think student loans the only one of that bunch that is a consumer loan that you can't discharge in bankruptcy. Over the years, the terms of the loans and the number of years that you were held back from filing bankruptcy changed. Ultimately, about 10 years ago, the decision was made you could never file for bankruptcy. We held a hearing on student loan debt in the Senate Judiciary Committee this week. I'm sorry Senator Cornyn has left the floor, but he and I have introduced a bill which has a good chance, I think. We know that student loans are the fastest growing category of household debt in America. 45 million student borrowers in our country. In little under a decade, student loan debt has ballooned from $1 trillion to $1.7 trillion. The average student borrower now carries $30,000 in debt, and many, especially those who are swindled by the for-profit colleges, owe well over $100,000. Americans of all ages are plagued by the debt, We've heard cases of grandmothers who said it to their granddaughters, "Why, of course I'll co-sign your student loan," to learn that when the student granddaughter defaulted, grandma was responsible for it. For some, it's holding them back from buying a first home, starting a family, a business. For others, it means delaying retirement because of this debt. This is not an individual misfortune. The student debt crisis is a threat to our economy. Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell has warned that student loan debt may be a drag on our economy by preventing Americans from basic, fundamental consumer purchases, cars, savings accounts for retirement, otherwise the economic growth of our country. So we had a hearing in the Judiciary Committee, and we examined how difficult it is for student borrowers to get financial relief. These are, as I said, are one of the very few categories of debt you cannot discharge in bankruptcy. You see, if you buy a home or car and you fall on really hard times, you can declare bankruptcy and have all those debts discharged. If you like to gamble and you're not very good at it, and you end up running up great debt on your credit card and you file for bankruptcy, your gambling debts through your credit cards can be discharged. You can even buy a yacht and have that debt discharged if you haven't paid it off. But if you're a student borrower who, despite your best efforts, falls on hard times, lured into debt perhaps by attending a worthless for-profit college, a fresh start is not in the cards for you. We had Diane Barta testify before the committee. She's from Richmond Hills, Georgia. 50 years old, mother of two. She has over $120,000 in student loan debt, much of it taken out for a worthless degree she received from the for-profit school Ashford University. I mentioned that to Senator Grassley during the hearing because Ashford University is a curious story. A small Catholic college in Iowa was about to go out of business, and the nuns were persuaded that there was a company that wanted to buy them. So they sold the campus to this company called Ashford University. Ashford had no intention of reopening the campus. What they basically did was start an online operation claiming the credit and the worthiness and the credibility of the previous college. Well, we looked into it. In fact, it was Tom Harkin of Iowa over 10 years ago who investigated it and found out that Ashford was a fraud. It was just generating huge profits for their CEO and a few others, not providing anything nearly resembling higher education. Miss Barta was a good person who worked hard. She had 2 degrees from a community college and then from another college before she went for a master's degree at Ashford University. That was her downfall. She talked about how she had to file for bankruptcy in 2012 after her husband lost his job as a commercial plumber. She managed to get relief from most of her debts, but certainly could not get discharged from her student loans that she'd taken out at Ashford University, this notorious for-profit school. Other student borrowers sent me their own stories. We've all heard them. Angela from Florida wrote, "I'm a single parent on a single income living paycheck to paycheck. I've had the stress of student loans haunting me for well over a decade. I'm still being haunted." Lisa in Nevada wrote, she'd given up her passion teaching. I repeat, teaching, because she needed to find a higher income job to pay off her student loans. She wrote, "It's absolutely disheartening when you try to better yourself in this country and you're punished and not rewarded." One more story. Ann from Washington State declared bankruptcy in 2000 because her student loan payments were so high she couldn't afford to pay her bills. She wrote, and I quote, "I never go on vacations, I never married or had children for fear of burdening them with my debt. I'm facing retirement with that threat still looming over my future. Social Security checks will be garnished for my student loans." This is clearly a crisis. Fortunately, both Republican and Democratic members of the Judiciary Committee agree that we need to do something. Congress has a responsibility to solve this problem. Wouldn't it be worth a headline somewhere on some website that we actually solved a problem like this? Before 1976, student loans were treated like any other type of loan in bankruptcy. If you were facing financial ruin, you could get relief. Congress got the idea that student borrowers were running to bankruptcy court right after they'd taken off their gowns and mortarboards and trying to wiggle out of their financial obligations. That's more anecdote than fact, but it was prevalent. Still, Congress began passing laws that made it harder to discharge student loans. Since 1998, student borrowers can only discharge federal student loans by proving that they suffer from something called undue hardship. Well, you'd think the cases I just read to you would be undue hardship, wouldn't you? People who are so deeply in debt and the debt keeps growing and they can't get out of it and they're making life choices that are terrible. Here's the issue. It is nearly impossible to prove undue hardship and discharge your student debt. That's your only escape now. In fact, in 2017, the Wall Street Journal found only four cases in the entire country of bankruptcy judge discharging student debt for undue hardship. For years, I've asked the Department of Education, the collection agency, to change the way they challenge these undue hardship cases. I'm still pushing on them, but Congress needs to do its part. Another witness who joined us on Tuesday was my State Attorney General, Kwame Raoul. He's been an advocate for student borrowers for a long time. He talked about these students being deceived and defrauded by these schools, particularly the for-profit colleges and universities. Well, we've decided to do something about it. We've introduced a bill called Fresh Start Through Bankruptcy. It will allow struggling borrowers to seek a bankruptcy discharge for their federal student loans after a waiting period of 10 years. That's a long time. And if you can't pay off that loan in 10 years and you believe there's no other recourse, you could file for bankruptcy and have it discharged. Our bill also includes another provision. I want to thank Jack Reed of Rhode Island, our colleague here. He introduced the original bill with this concept. It includes important provisions to hold accountable educational institutions, particularly these notorious for-profit colleges with consistently high default rates and low repayment rates. Two numbers you need to remember, and that's it, to understand for-profit colleges and universities. 8. What percentage of American high school graduates go to for-profit colleges and universities? 8%. Next question. What percentage of student loan defaults in the United States are by students from for-profit colleges and universities? 30. 8% of high school grads, 30% of student loan defaults. Why? Because these notorious, awful schools drag these young people into a debt they can never get out from under. If they finish, so-called finish and graduate from these schools, they find that they can't get the jobs that were promised. Their lives are virtually ruined. So we are basically saying it's time that these schools be held accountable. At this point, the Fresh Start Bankruptcy will provide a meaningful timeline to student borrowers who have no other options. It is a breakthrough. This is the first bipartisan bill the Senate has had, in my memory, to restore student borrowers' ability to discharge their loans in bankruptcy. I want to thank Senator Cornyn, Republican of Texas. We kind of jokingly say, you know, it's one of those situations where you're on stage announcing your bill and you turn to one another and say, have we both read this bill? Well, we have, and we understand it. We are also going to consider an element that was raised during the hearing by one of our expert witnesses of defining what undue hardship is. Right now, it appears the courts couldn't recognize it in any form. There certainly are cases. I talked about a quadriplegic veteran, disabled, unable to work, who is lured into one of these for-profit school scams, ends up in debt. Shouldn't they be able to discharge that student loan? There's no question they'll be able to find some great paying job in the future. They struggle to basically face up to their illnesses, and we hope that they have the very best future, but even then, it's tough to get out from under that debt. I hope this is the first of many steps that we'll take in the committee and other places on a bipartisan basis to deal with this challenge. Madam President, one other point. One way for students to avoid becoming buried in student loan debt in the first place is be very careful, particularly the for-profit colleges and universities. And secondly, take advantage of the affordable alternative community colleges. Community colleges are an underused superpower of our economy. They help students gain knowledge and skills they need to thrive, and they prepare workers to compete in the 21st century. I totally support President Biden's plan to build back better and provide every high school graduate to be able to continue their studies through community college without debt. The same goes for displaced workers who want to learn new skills to get a better job to support their futures. Americans will be able to obtain two-year degrees or specialized certificates without taking on mountains of debt. In the greatest country in the world, a college education shouldn't be a luxury. It should be guaranteed to everyone. That's the only way we can launch a new era of American prosperity and truly build back better after this pandemic.